The entire department burst into applause as the COO theatrically bowed and announced, "Let's all thank our expert for teaching us exactly what not to do." Someone actually started recording. Another employee whispered that security would probably escort her out before lunch. She smiled, quietly handed the project to her coworkers, and walked away, completely unaware that, at exactly 9:15 a.m., a notification about a $22 million contract was already racing toward the lead investor, carrying only one impossible message. Without her signature, nothing could move forward. The headquarters of Ashford Dynamics had the kind of silence that only expensive offices could afford. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected the morning sun, polished marble carried the sound of every confident step, and the aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the executive floor. By 8:45 a.m., the entire marketing department had been called into the main conference room without explanation. Conversations faded into whispers as employees exchanged puzzled glances, each trying to guess why the COO wanted everyone present. Emma Carter walked in, carrying only a slim leather notebook. 18 months of work on Project Horizon had brought her to this room, yet the strange tension in the air suggested this meeting wasn't about celebrating success. Richard Holloway, the company's charismatic COO, stood at the front of the room with the confidence of someone who loved an audience. His presentation filled the massive screen with charts, forecasts, and performance metrics, every one of them built from Emma's research. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes without mentioning her name once. A few people noticed. Most chose not to. The room remained politely quiet, the kind of silence that often says more than applause. When the final slide disappeared, Richard folded his arms, smiled, and slowly looked around the table before stopping on Emma. "I've spent the weekend reviewing this project," he announced, "and I've come to one simple conclusion." He let the pause stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Success doesn't come from working hard. It comes from knowing what you're doing. A few nervous laughs escaped from different corners of the room. Richard's smile widened. "Which brings me to our expert." He raised both hands with theatrical enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to the woman who almost convinced us she was indispensable." The laughter exploded much louder than anyone expected. Some employees clapped immediately. Others laughed simply because everyone else did. One person discreetly lifted a phone under the table, already imagining how popular this clip might become in the company group chat. Emma listened without changing her expression. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, and didn't ask a single question. Instead, she calmly gathered the project binders from the table and began handing them to the colleagues sitting closest to her. "You'll need this for the client timeline," she said, placing one folder into the operations manager's hands. Another went to finance, another to legal. "Everything is documented. The transition should be straightforward." Confusion quietly replaced amusement. This wasn't the reaction anyone expected. Richard had prepared for excuses, maybe even tears. Instead, Emma thanked everyone for the opportunity to work together, wished them success with the project, picked up her notebook, and walked toward the door as if she had simply finished another ordinary meeting. Just before leaving, Richard called after her with one last smirk. "That's it? No speech? No defense?" Emma stopped for a second but didn't turn around immediately. When she finally looked back, her voice was calm enough to make the room even quieter than before. "No, I've already left everything exactly where it belongs." Then she walked out, the glass door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than the laughter had moments earlier. For several seconds, no one spoke. Richard forced another confident smile and dismissed the meeting, convinced the lesson had been delivered. Employees slowly returned to their desks, still joking about what had just happened, while the digital clock on the conference room wall quietly changed to 9:06 a.m. None of them realized that in just 9 minutes, a notification would arrive on the lead investor's phone. A notification about a $22 million contract that required only one signature before it could move forward. And that signature no longer belonged to anyone still sitting in that room. If you think the worst part of Richard's decision was humiliating her in public, you're overlooking the one detail that everyone else overlooked too. At 9:15 a.m., while the marketing department was settling back into its routine and the story of Emma's public humiliation was already spreading through private chats, a vibration interrupted the lead investors' meeting 3 floors above. Daniel Mercer rarely checked his phone during presentations, but the notification came through a secure channel reserved only for transactions above $10 million. He glanced down almost absent-mindedly, expecting another legal confirmation. Instead, he stopped reading halfway through the first sentence. Execution blocked. Project Horizon. $22 million. Required approval unavailable. Authorized strategic signatory, Emma Carter. Daniel frowned. That couldn't be right. He opened the attached authorization record, expecting outdated information, but every document carried today's date. The contract had been structured months earlier with a dual protection clause requested by the client itself. The client had insisted that the person who designed the commercial framework remain the final approving authority to guarantee that none of the negotiated terms could be altered before execution. It wasn't a ceremonial signature. It was a legal requirement. He looked across the table at the general counsel. Who approved removing Emma Carter from the project? The attorney blinked. Removing? I wasn't aware she had been removed. Daniel pushed the phone across the table. Well, she just was. Silence settled over the room. Within seconds, another executive confirmed the same information through the internal system. Emma had voluntarily transferred operational responsibility for the project, but no one had initiated the legal process required to replace the strategic signatory. Worse still, replacing that authority wasn't something the company could do internally. The client had to approve the change, conduct a compliance review, and repeat several verification procedures. Under normal circumstances, the process could take weeks. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Meanwhile, back in the marketing department, Richard Holloway was enjoying the attention. Employees congratulated him on finally putting someone in their place, and the atmosphere had become strangely celebratory. He was halfway through explaining how the department would move forward without unnecessary hero figures when his assistant hurried toward him, pale enough to erase the confidence from his smile. The lead investor needs you. Immediately. Richard barely looked up. Tell him I'll be there after this. He said now. The assistant's voice didn't shake, but her expression did. Richard followed her through the executive corridor, assuming some investor wanted an update on Project Horizon. By the time he entered the boardroom, every seat around the polished walnut table was occupied. Daniel Mercer stood near the large screen instead of sitting, his jacket unbuttoned, his phone still in his hand. No one offered Richard coffee. No one greeted him. Daniel turned without smiling. Where is Emma Carter? Richard shrugged. She handed the project over this morning. The team can manage without her. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel placed the phone on the table and slowly slid it toward him. You seem to be misunderstanding something. Richard picked it up. As he read the notification, the confidence drained from his face sentence by sentence. This has to be a system error. It isn't. We'll assign another approver. You can't. We'll update the paperwork. You can't. Each answer landed harder than the previous one. The general counsel finally spoke. The client negotiated this protection personally. They trusted Emma's commercial structure, not just the company. Without her approval, The contract cannot be executed. The funds cannot be released, and if today's deadline expires, the agreement automatically enters renegotiation. Richard looked around the room, searching for someone to disagree. Nobody did. Daniel leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. So let me make sure I understand what happened this morning. The woman whose signature unlocks a $22 million contract was publicly ridiculed in front of her department, and nobody thought to inform this board before she walked out of the room? The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Richard opened his mouth, but found no explanation that sounded intelligent outside his own head. The silence that followed felt completely different from the one in the conference room earlier. That silence had been filled with laughter. This one was filled with calculations, financial, legal, and reputational. Every executive in the room understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. The biggest problem wasn't the delayed contract. It was that the only person who could solve it had left the building with perfect professionalism, leaving behind no scene, no argument, and no rule she had broken. Daniel straightened his jacket and looked around the table. Call the board. No one questioned the order. No one even reached for coffee anymore. Before noon, everyone in the company would hear that the morning's loudest applause had become the afternoon's most expensive mistake. But almost no one knew what Emma had already decided. If you were in Emma's position, would you have stayed silent, or would you have handled it differently? Tell me your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only getting started. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9:45 a.m., but by 9:32, nearly every director had already arrived. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom was nothing like the polished confidence that usually filled the floor. The leather chairs, the city skyline beyond the panoramic windows, even the untouched coffee cups seemed strangely out of place. No one was discussing market forecasts or quarterly growth anymore. Every conversation circled back to one name, Emma Carter. Richard Holloway sat near the end of the table, no longer looking like the man who had commanded a room less than an hour earlier. He had already repeated 3 different versions of the same explanation. He believed she was no longer essential. He assumed the project documentation would be enough. He expected legal to handle any administrative changes. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became that none of those assumptions had ever been verified. Daniel Mercer waited until the room fell completely silent before placing a thick folder in the center of the table. "This," he said calmly, "is the client agreement everyone claims to understand." No one interrupted him. He opened the contract to a page covered in highlighted clauses and turned it so the directors could read. Beneath a section titled Strategic Execution Authority appeared a single name, Emma Carter. Not the COO, not the CEO, not the legal department, her. "The client requested this clause during negotiations," Daniel continued. "Do you know why?" No one answered. "Because every competing firm promised numbers." Emma explained the risks. She redesigned the entire commercial framework in one afternoon and saved the client nearly $6 million over the life of the agreement. After that meeting, the client said something I haven't forgotten. He paused before repeating the sentence almost word for word. "If she's not involved in the final execution, we don't sign." Several directors slowly leaned back in their chairs. For many of them, this was the first time they had heard the complete story. Richard frowned. "Why wasn't I informed?" The general counsel looked directly at him. "You were." The room became perfectly still. She opened another folder and slid several printed emails across the table. "The legal department sent 3 reminders over the past 4 months regarding the strategic signatory requirement. 2 were acknowledged by your office. Richard immediately reached for the documents. The timestamps were real. His executive assistant had forwarded them. One had even been marked high priority. He remembered seeing the subject line. He also remembered deciding to read it later. Later had never come. No one said a word while he stared at the pages. The realization arrived without drama, but it hit harder than any public accusation could have. This wasn't a hidden clause. It wasn't an unexpected legal trap. It had been sitting in his inbox for months, waiting for 5 minutes of attention. Daniel finally broke the silence. "So let's stop pretending this is about a signature." He folded his hands. "This is about leadership." His voice remained steady, but every sentence landed with increasing weight. A leader can make a bad decision. That's unfortunate. A leader can overlook an email. That's human. But publicly humiliating the person who carried our largest account without checking whether the company could function without her? He let the unfinished sentence speak for itself. That is negligence. Richard instinctively tried to defend himself. "I acted based on performance concerns." Daniel looked at him for several seconds. "Then where is the performance report?" Richard hesitated. "The department, the report, there isn't a finalized one." "And the investigation?" "There wasn't one." "So you held a public disciplinary meeting without a formal review, without HR present, without consulting legal, and without verifying the contractual structure of the company's largest active deal." The boardroom became painfully quiet. Nobody needed to raise their voice. Facts were doing all the work. One of the independent directors slowly closed his notebook. "I've served on corporate boards for 22 years, he said. "I've seen failed acquisitions, shareholder lawsuits, and product recalls. But I've never seen someone risk a $22 million contract to make a point in front of an audience." No one disagreed. Outside the boardroom, however, the atmosphere across headquarters had already begun to shift. The jokes that filled the office less than an hour earlier were disappearing. Employees who had laughed during the meeting were quietly deleting messages from internal chats. The phone recording someone had taken was no longer being shared. Instead, people whispered a different question. Did Emma really control the contract? No one seemed to know the complete answer. What they did know was enough to replace confidence with uncertainty. Back inside the boardroom, Daniel picked up his phone. "Has anyone spoken to Emma?" The HR director looked down. She answered one email. Every head turned toward her. "What did it say?" The HR director swallowed before reading it aloud. "Thank you for letting me know about the board meeting. I hope today's discussions are productive. All project materials were transferred this morning to ensure continuity. Please direct any future communication through the appropriate channels." That was all. No accusations, no anger, no demands, no mention of the humiliation. Just quiet professionalism. For reasons no one could explain, that email made the room feel even heavier. Daniel slowly stood. "I don't know whether she'll agree to help us," he said. "But I do know one thing." Everyone looked up. "If we want this company to recover, the next conversation with Emma Carter won't begin with instructions." He looked directly at Richard. "It will begin with respect." The board had finally understood what the department had laughed at that morning. But whether Emma was willing to listen was a question no contract could answer. By early afternoon, Ashford Dynamics looked like a different company. The confident rhythm that usually carried people from meeting to meeting had disappeared, replaced by cautious conversations that stopped the moment an executive walked by. Even the open office, normally filled with ringing phones and overlapping discussions, felt unusually restrained. Word had spread far faster than anyone expected. Employees didn't know every detail, but they knew enough. The $22 million contract was frozen, the board had been called into an emergency session, and the woman who had been laughed out of the conference room that morning had somehow become the most important person in the building. Richard Holloway watched the change unfold from his office. Just a few hours earlier, people had been congratulating him in the hallway. Now the same employees avoided making eye contact. His inbox filled with questions he couldn't answer. Legal wanted clarification. Finance wanted a timeline. Operations wanted to know whether the client had been informed. Every message seemed to begin with the same phrase: urgent. For the first time in years, Richard realized that authority could disappear much faster than it was earned. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer decided that emails and formal requests would accomplish nothing. If the company wanted any chance of moving forward, someone had to speak with Emma directly. He asked Human Resources for her contact information, but before making the call, he requested something unusual. "I want her employment file," he said. "Not the summary, the complete record." Within minutes, a thick folder landed on the conference table. Daniel expected to find glowing performance reviews. What he found instead made him stare at the pages in disbelief. Emma had never received a promotion despite repeatedly exceeding every performance target. She had trained managers who later became her supervisors. She had resolved client crises that generated millions in revenue, yet the recognition had almost always been credited to someone higher up the organizational chart. Several recommendations for advancement had been postponed, redirected, or quietly closed without explanation. It wasn't one isolated incident. It was a pattern stretching back years. Daniel looked at the HR director. "Did no one notice this?" She sighed. "People noticed. They assumed someone else was handling it." That answer hung over the room like a cloud. It perfectly described what had happened all morning. Everyone assumed someone else had checked the contract. Someone else had reviewed the legal requirements. Someone else had protected one of the company's most valuable employees. In the end, nobody had. Daniel finally dialed Emma's number. She answered after the second ring. "Emma Carter." Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Emma, this is Daniel Mercer. I know, your number was in the contract documentation." For a brief second, Daniel couldn't help smiling. Even now, she sounded more prepared than the people still sitting inside headquarters. "I'd like to meet with you." "I'm no longer in the office." "I know." "I've already transferred the project materials." "I know that too." There was a short silence before Daniel chose his next words carefully. "This isn't about the project." Emma didn't respond immediately. "It's about this morning." Another pause. When she finally spoke, there was no bitterness in her voice. "Mr. Mercer, nothing that happened this morning violated my employment agreement. I wasn't threatened, I wasn't forced to resign, and I completed a full handover before leaving. Professionally speaking, I've done exactly what I was supposed to do." Her answer was impossible to argue with. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Then let me ask a different question. Would you be willing to have a conversation with the board?" "I'll listen." "Thank you. But listening and agreeing aren't the same thing." The call ended a few moments later. No promises, no negotiations, just a meeting. When Daniel informed the board, no one celebrated. They all understood that Emma hadn't accepted anything. She had simply agreed to hear what they had to say. After everything that had happened, even that felt more generous than anyone expected. Across town, Emma sat alone by the window of a quiet cafe overlooking the river. Her untouched cup of tea had long since cooled, while the notebook she had carried out of the office rested beside her. She wasn't reviewing contracts or preparing speeches. She was simply watching people pass by outside, as if reclaiming a calm morning that had been interrupted. Her phone remained face down on the table. She hadn't ignored the company's calls out of anger. She had answered the only one she believed deserved an answer. Back at headquarters, another notification appeared on Daniel's screen. It wasn't from legal or finance. It came from the client. "We understand there has been an internal leadership issue. Before discussing the contract further, we would appreciate confirmation that Ms. Emma Carter will be present at any future strategic meeting. Daniel read the message twice before placing the phone on the table. The client hadn't asked about Richard. They hadn't asked about the CEO. They hadn't even asked whether the paperwork had been fixed. They had asked for one person. And for the second time that day, the entire room understood that trust, once earned, could become more valuable than any executive title. The board now knew what it needed to do, but no one could predict whether Emma would accept a seat at the table she had quietly walked away from only hours earlier. The following morning, the board assembled once again, but this time there was no sense of urgency in the room. The panic had burned itself out overnight, leaving behind something far more uncomfortable: accountability. Reports were neatly stacked in front of every director, legal opinions had been prepared, and the client had postponed the signing window by just 48 hours. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give the company one final opportunity to repair the damage. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Emma Carter walked in wearing the same calm expression she had carried out of the office the previous day. No dramatic entrance, no attempt to make anyone uncomfortable. She greeted the receptionist on her way in, thanked the assistant who escorted her upstairs, and took the empty chair Daniel Mercer had reserved beside him. Around the table, several directors stood to shake her hand. Richard remained seated for a moment before slowly rising as well. Daniel was the first to speak. "Emma, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. We owe you an apology." She nodded politely, but didn't interrupt. Richard cleared his throat. The confidence that had once defined him had disappeared entirely. "What happened yesterday," he began, "was inappropriate. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I spoke before understanding the full situation, and I embarrassed you in front of your colleagues. I'm sorry." The room stayed silent. Emma looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I appreciate the apology. Nothing more." She didn't lecture him. She didn't remind everyone what had happened. She didn't ask for revenge or demand anyone's resignation. Her restraint carried more weight than anger ever could. Daniel opened the contract folder. "The client has made its position clear. They are willing to proceed under one condition: that you remain the strategic signatory and participate in the implementation phase. We'd like to know whether you're willing to continue." Emma folded her hands on the table. "My answer isn't about yesterday." Several directors exchanged confused looks. "It's about the future." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "I spent a long time thinking about what this company actually needs. This isn't a salary proposal." Daniel picked up the page. It contained only 3 points. All major project decisions must be documented. Performance reviews must include independent oversight. Project ownership must always reflect actual responsibility. No bonus, no executive title, no special privileges. Just 3 governance changes that would prevent the same mistake from happening to someone else. One director smiled quietly. Another leaned back and whispered, almost to himself, "That's why the client trusts her." Daniel looked around the room. "I'd like these recommendations entered into the minutes and adopted as board policy." Every hand around the table went up. The vote was unanimous. Richard was the last to raise his hand. Only then did Emma answer the question everyone had been waiting to hear. "Yes," she said. "I'll sign the contract." A collective breath seemed to leave the room at once. Within the hour, the legal documents were finalized. The client countersigned electronically, the $22 million agreement became fully effective, and the confirmation reached every executive involved in the transaction. Months of work had been saved, not because someone fought the loudest, but because someone chose professionalism over pride. The story, however, spread through the company much faster than the contract itself. Employees stopped talking about the applause. Instead, they talked about the meeting where a woman who had every reason to seek revenge chose to improve the system instead. New managers referenced the incident during leadership training. HR quietly updated several internal procedures. Legal introduced mandatory reviews for strategic authority clauses. Without announcing it, the company had begun changing. A week later, Richard passed Emma in the hallway. This time he stopped first. "Good morning, Emma," she smiled. "Good morning, Richard." There was no bitterness between them, only the quiet understanding that respect earned after failure is far more valuable than admiration borrowed from a crowd. Sometimes the loudest sound in an office isn't applause. Sometimes it's the silence that follows when everyone realizes they applauded the wrong person.